Hi, I'm Dean Bushmiller with Expanding Security, and this is Decryption, or Cryptanalysis, depending on how you look at it. Now, if you're not seeing the full version of this, go to expandingsecurity.com, where you can also get quizzes, glossaries, readings, and this mind map with all the dynamic links. Use or consumption of this material by AI is expressly forbidden. So let's get started. In Decryption, before we get started, we need to talk about some prerequisites here. If you haven't seen Cryptology Principles and Practices, please go watch that first, because I'm going to assume a lot of knowledge about cryptology in this presentation here. Also, if you're looking for the more technical aspects of this, how to be a cryptanalyst, how to be a decryptor in the world, then there is a separate companion video for this. It's about 75 minutes long. It's about tools and techniques on how to actually do those things. Now, just by the way, I don't do the math in there, but I definitely dig into how you actually get things done. We're looking at our organization's cryptographic practices from the viewpoint of a cryptanalyst. Now, the process would be examination of the ciphers that are underlying all the software that we're using. That's an easy thing to say. That's a very difficult thing to do, to figure out what the bill of materials is. We may even try to recover plain text in our process and be like the attacker, just like you would do in penetration test, only now what we're doing is we're looking at data, analyzing data, and saying, can we recover the plain text without the key? Or even if there is a key, can we find the key? In some cases we can. We're also going to look at the establishment of trust across our environment. Now, the methodology for this is easy to say again, but difficult to do. We're trying to break codes here. Now, we're not breaking the algorithms. What we're usually probably doing is brute forcing. We could investigate the algorithms, go and look and say, hey, what are people saying about SHA-1 or MD5? Or why can't we use RC4? This vendor says, hey, we're going to use RC4 here, and this is perfectly acceptable in this area. But our policy says, no, we can't do that. Well, what do we do? How do we get an exception? Is it acceptable? We'll build techniques in assessing those weaknesses. And generally what it means is we'll figure out what all of the encryption algorithms are. Actually, what we'll do is we'll get a list of all those encryption algorithms, and we'll say anytime anybody purchases anything, these are the things that are on the hot list. If these things exist or they mention these things, that requires us to do a cryptographic study of that organization in even just the smallest ways. It doesn't have to be really, really complex. And then if there is a flaw within that, or they use inappropriate activities like, I'll say like sending the key or exposing our API key. Well, then we need to investigate that flaw and say, hey, we need to get rid of this piece of software. Or if we built the software, we need to go around and don't do that bad to the developer. They probably won't like that in a business setting, but we'll try anyway. The threats. We're looking at the attacks on the systems, the exploitation of flaws, and the recovery of keys. And that's the new thing. That is, the adversaries are always looking for the keys, so therefore we should always look for the keys. Okay. Now this plays a role in our assurance long term for our organization. We will do analysis. The components of analysis are pretty straightforward. The easier thing to do is to find out what the algorithm choices are, but not necessarily why from those companies. But we'll make our own choices here. And then, does that represent a vulnerability to us? Now, in the context of risk, when we look at this, we're going to look at how the adversaries would attack us. What are their strategies for attacking us? And then we'll monitor our systems for those kinds of attacks at the cryptographic level, which we've talked about vulnerability management a lot. We've talked about threats a lot, but monitoring the systems for cryptographic failures, that's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to have to explain something different to you there. We're going to look at the assessment of our controls that are in place that may help us with this. We're going to review our logs for this certain activities. and we're going to look for intrusion detection like we have been all along, but we're just switching, just twisting our view toward cryptography in this. So as defenders, how do we understand cryptanalysis from our standpoint, and what are the implications on our organization? Your methodology in this has to be realistic for your organization. So when we start off, we ask a general risk assessment, risk management question. If you look at the most sensitive stuff inside of your organization, the super duper sensitive stuff that you have to protect for a long time, and you pick out one leaked record, how much will that cost the organization? And it could be your organization is so sensitive, government, military, research and development, that one leak could cost you 90% of your viable concern. For example, drug companies, when they're doing research on a new drug in a new class of drugs, their research department is really, really secretive even about what the class of drug is, because they don't want others to figure out what they're doing or say, hey, their go-to-market strategy is this, and we're going to go ahead and do that exact same thing. And so they'll keep this really, really private. They won't tell anybody until a certain point in time where, okay, now it's time to sell the drug. But before that, if it leaked out, that represents, and in some cases, this is, 10, 20, $30 million worth of investment that is just flushed down the tubes. So if it's 90% of your assets with this, 90% of your value lost with this one leak, then you really need to go to the next level here. And I'll point to the next level, but we won't do it because most of us are looking at our worst case loss is like 9% of our total asset value for something that's really, really important to our organization. An example of this would be our customer database, right? Not all of our customers are going to leave us immediately if we have a failure. We're going to lose a big chunk of our business, like 9% of our business, but it's not going to be all of our business in those cases. And if it gets down to the 1% level, then we don't even worry about it for this particular activity. So start off there with your risk assessment and then go, okay, now let's pretend it's 90%. There's a standard solution to this problem that governments and militaries around the world have figured out. Spend money on systems that are cryptographically either enhanced or proven to protect. What's that look like? You go to the common criteria list. You look for products that have been evaluated, and they have a whole products list. And by the way, it's in the link section, that all those products are EAL4 or better. And you purchase those products and you deploy those products for that entire line of business, wherever that data starts within your organization and wherever it ends. The whole data life cycle now is protected by these tools here, and they are implemented well, and you do very, very strict change control. That's if you're in that business. That's if management says yes. If they say yes to this and they say, hey, this one asset, 90% of our business or half of our business, we need to do these things, that's fine. And they'll say, well, how much extra is it going to cost us? And the answer is somewhere between 5 to 10% more per year. 5 to 10 times more per year in our budget. They go, well, it's not really that important. You go, okay, well, that's fine. But that's what it's going to cost us because we have to go cradle to grave on all of this stuff. Okay. Let's set that aside for a second and let's pretend that we don't do that. Let's just go down the levels here and do cryptanalysis as part of our mission. So we're going to use cryptanalysis as part of the mission. We're going to think about it in those ways. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So first, what we do is we look at the attacker's goals. We can do this by going to MITRE ATT&CK and looking at the kinds of goals that those advanced persistent threats have there. That would be a reasonable place to start. What are they going to try and do? They're going to try to get, you guessed it, the keys. They're going to try to intercept our messages, and they're going to try and forge messages that are assumed to be correct. Now, the unlikely attacker, this is this odd attackers that are out there. They'll start doing complexity evaluation. How hard is it to break in? So if we can go ahead and reduce this key space by 70%, how long will it take us to brute force the rest of the key space? That kind of thing. Or structural analysis of the algorithms that we're using and the way that we're actually deploying them. I really don't think these are the kinds of adversaries that are after you unless your email address ends in .mil or .gov, those kinds of things. Here's where I think that you're going to see a lot. And I'm just going to give you 2 examples here. 3. Algorithmic choices. So you're going to purchase or deploy software. Hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and use PKZip. We think that that's a really good tool for doing compression, for transmitting files. Okay. How does PKZip do its encryption? By the way, it does a pretty good job. It uses AES in its implementations. I think it's a reasonable tool. Let's use weird zip free tool out there that we found on the internet. What kind of encryption does it use? I don't know. Well, we have to find out before we go ahead and use that. Well, let me just download it and play with it. No. Software bill of materials at that point. It could also be inside the software that we build. Our developers have to follow reasonable policy that we have internally. And the earlier they start inside of that process with that encryption as a requirement, they will work around and make it work. If we say to them, figure it out later on, they'll figure it out later on and they'll bolt it on and it won't work. But if we say, these are our demands up front, they will get creative using those particular demands and achieve the objective. I've seen it happen many, many times. So let's look at 2 examples here. How about side channel analysis? You go, boy, that's not really a big thing for us. Well, it's called testing for timing. And so if you think about it, a server hashes a password only if the username exists. So that's the setup for this thing. Now, all of them, by the way, they should do it completely and it should all be the same timing. But your server that you've got set up says, hey, I'm only going to hash the password if the username exists. So if login exists, it takes 500 milliseconds to return. We're not even talking about the password here. We're just talking about login exists. If the login does not exist, it takes 50 milliseconds. What does that tell us? Well, the login exists. So if I key in and I fuzz inside of those boxes and I fuzz all sorts of different letters and all sorts of different characters in there, and even first name dot last name, that kind of thing, which are most logins right there, right? If they exist, it's going to take 500 milliseconds. I know that somebody has an account on this system if it takes a long time. Now, you want to have detection mechanisms that go along with this, and this is what you're going to have to build that I'm not going to tell you every single one of because there's not enough time for this, but there's tools, don't worry. The detection in this case is the attacker will send hundreds of usernames. And so you can measure for that. You can look for that. You can detect for that. Let's switch gears here and talk about something that scares everybody. Padding oracle attacks. Ooh, what's that? Something really fancy. No. You ask the question, is AES CBC being used in web accessible applications? I'm just asking that question. You go, well, I don't know. Well, maybe we should find this out. But if it is, what we're talking about in this attack is that the final block in CBC is padded with extra bytes. That's what's happening. And that's the padding attack. That's the start of it. Are we using AES CBC? Hold on a second. We'll have to figure that out. So let's test for that. Well, no, we don't even have to test for that. It's not complicated. I view your site and I go, like here it was Google Gemini, and I right click, connection is secure, and then I go to more information, and then I drill down into the more information, and it says, TLS AES 128 Gallios counter mode, GCM. It's not CBC MAC. So your adversaries can look and see, based on your certificate that is supplied to them without doing anything other than looking like a regular end user, that you are susceptible to this attack. Okay, so what's the attack? Well, here's the attack process. So they send an encrypted message to the server, okay? The server decrypts and checks if the padding is valid. Now, what they want to do is they want to send all of the different possible messages. There's only 256 possible messages. One of them is going to be valid, and the rest are not. Okay, now you got that? That's padding. Padding is at the end of communication, so therefore we know that this particular pad value inside of here is, we'll call it X for a moment in time. It's a byte value. We know that. What we do in this chaining attack is we take, once we have this block decrypted and we know what this block is, then we repeat the process, because all the blocks are chained together in CBC. If you're looking at that mode, all those blocks are chained together. So now what we do is we go to the previous block and we decrypt it. And we keep on decrypting, and we just keep on moving up that chain, back up that chain until we decrypt the entire message. You go, Dean, this is an awful attack. How do we solve this? We use AES Gallios counter mode, GCM. You use modern algorithms, and then what's going to happen is somebody in your organization is going to go, but Dean, we have old customers that are using old Android devices that don't speak Gallios counter mode. Do we want to allow adversaries to attack us, or can we upgrade those customers? I know one of my customers that I worked with a long time ago, what they did was they said, we can't move off of this particular system because we can't afford it. They were the last customer to be using this system. So we went, okay, how much are we paying in support costs to solve this problem for this one customer? Having all of this stuff, all of this equipment, all of these things in place. And we totaled it up and said, we'll just give them the new devices for free. We'll eat the cost and give them the new devices for free. It was much better than having all of this support over there. And they went, oh, well, fine. We're the last one. We'll go ahead and go. And we brought in our experts and go and deployed it. And everything was just fine for them. So you're going to have people in business that are going to push back on the methodology that you set up, on the problem that is presented in business. The marketing people, the sales people are going to throw up, all sorts of things in front of you. Just do the math for them. Maybe it'll help them to go ahead and make these decisions and move away from those awful encryption like that CBC MAC stuff.